that shows, let's just go through the highlights here. The effect works, it's reproducible, it's consistent, it works in animals. Listening to music affects many different portions of the brain. Mostly limited, in short-term studies anyway, mostly limited to spatial temporal reasoning, but it can spill over into other areas. I would say language and mathematics would be the most obvious. And if you look at the diagram that I've put together over the last couple of years, the four main quadrants of that are, let me just think about it for a minute. I think it's music, mathematics, language, and science as kind of the four pillars, so to speak, of how human consciousness kind of relates to reality, based on certain structures that exist in nature beyond simple patterns. I mean, if you look at the entirety of mathematics, which I have only barely started to study mathematics. I just bought two textbooks on mathematics just this year. So in 2026, like I said recently, in 2026, I'm going to call myself a mathematician because now I'm actually reading books on mathematics. But if you look at mathematics, music, language, and our appreciation of the natural sciences, all of those are patterns that humans can recognize. But they don't simply exist as patterns because we recognize them. They exist as patterns in nature, you know? So one of the things that I saw a couple of years ago, I think the author's name was Penrose, and the conversation that he was leading, it was an interview or a two-person conversation. But he asked a very interesting, or he addressed a very interesting question in that interview or that conversation. And I think what he says about mathematics could also apply to language, natural sciences, and music, if I didn't already say that. So again, the four main cornerstones are music, mathematics, language, and natural sciences. But in that particular conversation, Dr. Penrose, I presume, addresses the question, is mathematics discovered or invented?
In a sense, that had to be so, because if the physical world depended so precisely on these mathematical laws, I couldn't have known what to do in a certain sense if the mathematics hadn't already been there. I mean, it's not us that imposes this on the world. It's out there. Sometimes people think that, you know, maybe the reason we have good mathematical laws of physics is that's the best way we can come to understand the world. But it's something more than that. It really is out there in the world.
Well, that's the argument. Whether mathematics is invented by us, by human beings trying to impose our way of thinking on the physical world, or whether it is discovered because it's already out there and we're finding it because it's already there. Those are the two polar views.
Sometimes people do argue. They say, well, you know, it's just our way of organizing the what we see about us. But I really don't think that's good enough. But
if mathematics, like music, like language, like natural science, is purely an external phenomenon, obviously that's the question that he's addressing. Is it something that exists independently of human logic, or is it something that humans construct and then kind of impose on the universe? You know, so I guess one of the ways of looking at that might be the directionality of that relationship.
The ancient Greeks found three relationships between notes especially pleasing. Now we call them an octave, a fifth, and a fourth.
An octave is easy to remember because it's the first two notes of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Somewhere. A fifth sounds like this. La, la. Or the first two notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And a fourth sounds like la, la. You can think of it as the first two notes of Here Comes the Bride.
In the 6th century BCE, the Greek philosopher Pythagoras is said to have discovered that those beautiful musical relationships were also beautiful mathematical relationships by measuring the lengths of the vibrating strings. In an octave, the string lengths create a ratio of 2 to 1. In a fifth, the ratio is 3 to 2, and in a fourth, it is 4 to 3.
seeing a common pattern throughout sound, that could be a big eye-opener of saying, well, if this exists in sound, and if it's true universally through all sounds, this ratio could exist universally everywhere, right? And doesn't it?
Pythagoreans worshiped the idea of numbers. The fact that simple ratios produced harmonious sounds was proof of a hidden order in the natural world, and that order was made of numbers. A profound insight that mathematicians and scientists continue to explore to this day.
Music matters for the mind in two important ways. First, quantitatively, because we generally spend hours and ultimately years listening to music, either directly, attentively, or passively, whether we choose it, or if it is in the background and ambiance of other settings, such as while working, shopping, eating, and exercising. As such, musical patterns, and especially any accompanying lyrics, eventually become hardwired into our neural brain circuitry and thereby influence our perspectives, mood, and abilities as an extension of the Mozart effect. Second, qualitatively because of the aforementioned rewiring of the brain depending on the quality, complexity, and cleanliness, when instrumental or contamination, with lyrics of the music. Occasionally, we are seduced by tonality that carries new ideas in the accompanying lyrics, and this eventually forces us to change our perspectives and thereby change our lives. Dr. Alex Vasquez, January 2026.
Mas quem nada sai da minha frente que eu quero passar, pois o samba já animado, o que eu quero é samba. Este samba que é misto de maracatu, é samba de preto veio, samba de preto. Mas quem nada, samba como este tão legal, você não vai querer que eu chegue no final.
Music matters for the mind in two important ways. First, quantitatively, because we generally spend hours and ultimately years listening to music, either directly, attentively, or passively, whether we choose it, or if it is in the background and ambiance of other settings, such as while working, shopping, eating, and exercising. As such, musical patterns, and especially any accompanying lyrics, eventually become hardwired into our neural brain circuitry and thereby influence our perspectives, mood, and abilities as an extension of the Mozart effect. Second, qualitatively because of the aforementioned rewiring of the brain depending on the quality, complexity, and cleanliness, when instrumental or contamination, with lyrics of the music. Occasionally, we are seduced by tonality that carries new ideas in the accompanying lyrics, and this eventually forces us to change our perspectives and thereby change our lives. Dr. Alex Vasquez, January 2026.
Mas quem nada sai da minha frente que eu quero passar, pois o samba já animado, o que eu quero é samba. Este samba que é misto de maracatu, é samba de preto veio, samba de preto. Mas quem nada, samba como este tão legal, você não vai querer que eu chegue no final.
Good morning, everybody. Dr. Vasquez coming to you live, and today we are going to talk about music. And I've made several posts over the last couple of years about music kind of as a tangent or just kind of a diversionary, kind of eclectic mix of different conversations. But today I'm actually going to provide a little more structure to that conversation because when I was looking at, I was in a conversation by email with one of my favorite musicians who I'll mention in a few minutes. And in the course of that conversation, I was telling him my way of appreciating music, obviously as a listener and nowhere near a professional musician, of course. But I was telling this very accomplished musician about certain perspectives I had and some of the research that supported that perspective. And then, of course, I started looking at the research more, and for that reason, we're having this conversation right now. So one of the articles of several that I looked at the other day was this one that I'm going to review right now, and this is going to be kind of the centerpiece of today's conversation. This article obviously appropriately titled The Mozart Effect. That's kind of the basis for this concept and the things that I'm going to talk about within that concept and then kind of extend from there. This article is really good. It's maybe about 3 pages, published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, April 2001. So I'm going to provide a reading of that article kind of in the middle of this conversation. So I'm going to introduce a few topics, then we'll take a look at the entirety of the article. And then I'll give you, some of my deeper, perhaps, perspectives. I haven't prepared this particular conversation, even though I have a few ideas kind of floating around in my head. And that's going to be, obviously, somewhat of a task to kind of herd those cats into something that appears to be a linear conversation. So I had good and bad luck in my youth, as I assume most of us did. But one stroke of good luck occurred when I was living in Houston, Texas. I was about 20 or 21 years old. And, back in the day, especially in Houston, Texas, which has got to be one of the most boring cities in the world, I remember some Friday night or Saturday night, I assume, I went out with my friends and we went to a record store. And back in the day, this would have been 1991-ish. It was between 1991 or 1992, because I remember having a conversation about this in 1992, so it obviously had to happen before then. So 1991 or 1992, I'm just out with the guys, and we went to a music store. And, back in the day, we bought physical records, like disc records, or we bought audio cassettes. In fact, I might even I do have an audio cassette, but it's in my other piece of furniture. And the technology wasn't such that we could sample a piece of music before we bought it. We just had to buy it and hope that it turned out to be okay. So, whatever. I'm walking down the aisles of this music store and they've got records in one section and then audio cassettes in another section. Some of you might not even know what an audio cassette is because it's not really technology that anybody uses anymore. I'll show you what an audio cassette is. For those of you who don't know, I think I have one over here. Yeah. So here's an audio cassette, which I have likewise, I've carried this around now for 25 years, this audio cassette. So like I was saying, back in the day, when we went to buy music, we either had to know something about it or we just had to go for luck. And so I still remember, this was a record store on a big street in Houston, Texas called Westheimer. And I remember coming down the aisle, I made a turn to the left, and in front of me was an audio cassette titled Primal Magic by Struns and Farah. And I didn't know anything about them. I had no way of sampling the music. I had no way of being, previously exposed to that music. But I just looked at the cassette, and it had a pretty picture on the cover. And back in the day, that's what we did. And that's how we purchased music. So I ended up buying, not this particular cassette, but a cassette of their music. And I have to say that changed my life. So again, I was more or less 20 years old, 21 maybe, but between 20 and 21. And so that was a musical experience that I had. I'll talk about it more in this conversation. That was a musical event, so to speak, for me. Actually, I had 3 musical events around that time. But that was one of them that really changed my life. The other musical event that happened for me around that age was I was listening to the radio, And they played a song by the Sundays, and they were a quartet, as I recall, from the UK. And I remember liking one of their songs, and then I actually called I think I called the DJ. That's what we did back in the day, you know. And I said, "Hey, you just played this song, and I want to buy it. I want to know more about it and who it was." And they said, "Oh, that was the Sundays." And so I ended up buying it. I bought a used CD of their music, as I recall, and at a place called Record Rack, which was also on Lower Westheimer. And that also changed my life. So, but the first change that I attributed to Strunz and Farrar was from the complexity and the tonality of their music. The way that the Sundays kind of changed my life was through their lyrics. And the theme, or a theme, of their music is not very intellectual. It's very touchy-feely, and but that's exactly the point. I kind of needed that at that point in my life. I don't recall the lead singer's last name, but I think her first name was Harriet, and I liked their music, and because I listened to their music, I therefore obviously had to listen to the lyrics. And at some point, you know, those lyrics kind of changed some of my perspectives. Again, not because they were intellectual, but because they weren't intellectual. And they were just kind of like touchy-feely, go with the flow kind of thing. And I didn't have a lot of that in my life at the time. So I do feel like their music also changed my life, because in order to listen to the music, I had to listen to the lyrics. And over time, listening to the lyrics gave me perspectives that at that time were outside of my personal experience, whether my family, my city, or my social experience. So either today or in another video, I'll talk more about that if necessary. But I'll give you a sample of, well, I'll play the part of her song that kind of changed my life. Again, I was like really, at that point in my life, I had just gotten out of military school, you know, around that age. I was very disciplined. I was studying. I was, you know, trying to create this career path for myself. And I was thinking, man, I'm going to study this, and then I'm going to study this, and then I'm going to study this, and all this kind of stuff. But I also needed, you know, some influence in my life that was more about like just taking it easy. And I had a friend at the time, and he was kind of a surfer dude. And yeah, he was that as well. But the music was a bit more explicit and kind of changed some of my perspectives. The other event that I just thought of while I was already in this conversation is around 1991 or 1992, the Lollapalooza Festival came to Texas, and they played 2 consecutive days in Dallas, Texas. And I went to that. I bought a ticket, 2 tickets, one for myself and another for a friend of mine who ended up not coming. He was living in Georgia at the time, or Alabama. So I bought a ticket for him. He couldn't make it. So I ended up using the tickets myself. But I drove myself from Houston to Dallas, went to the concert, and then drove myself home that night. But that was also kind of a life-changing event for me because, again, coming from kind of the restricted social environment of Houston, Texas, including my family there, that was a life-changing event for me because it was the first time I'd ever seen like people just kind of exuberantly happy. And then pretty soon thereafter, I would see the same thing in Seattle, Washington, and a trip that I made there. I've talked about that before, but I guess those are from my own experience, 3 ways that I think about music in terms of like music as something that can actually change your life, or in this case, change my life. One is through the structure of the music itself, and that's what I get from Strunz and Farrar, and I have gotten it consistently for 30 years, I guess, 30 years of my life. And I will always appreciate that and respect that has happened. The other way, beyond the structure and the tonality or complexity of music or the structure of the music, is the influence of lyrics, you know? Because if I like a song or if you like a song, we're going to listen to the song. And if it has certain lyrics, we have to be aware of what those lyrics are telling us. You know, in my case, I was aware of it and I wanted what the lyrics were telling me, even though I wasn't really at that time like fully prepared to live those lyrics per se. I was aware that the lyrics represented for me something I didn't have in my own social experience. And so it was a way of being exposed to new ideas that could pose some benefit, but could also pose some risk, you know, because, you know, any idea can be risky if taken out of context or if misapplied, I suppose, or if applied in an imbalanced way. But what I did need at my time in that life was just to be a little lighter, and that's what that music helped me achieve. And the third part of my musical experience or musical awakening or whatever was just seeing the effect that a musical environment could have on people and just letting them be happy. So for me, that I'd never seen anything like that, you know, like this wild music festival with like Henry Rollins, who's also had a lot of influence on me when I was younger. But it was Henry Rollins, Jane's Addiction, Ice-T, a group called Fishbone. And yeah, it was just a wild, happy, free music festival.
Ugly. You and me. You see the real me.
Yeah, it was just a wild, happy, free music festival. So anyway, those are kind of some experiences that I'll weave into today's conversation or into another conversation. I did write some extensive notes. You obviously know that I never write extensive notes, but I did write a few notes. Oh yeah, I was talking about like the danger. I mentioned the danger of music and the danger, especially of musical lyrics. So it's just something that I think we have to be aware of. And I've been aware of this for many years, even though I've never talked about it. But I do remember when I was growing up, again in Houston, Texas, you know, we just listened to what was ever on the radio. And because we didn't have no one was carrying around a digital phone where you could control, you know, the exact song that you want to listen to at that moment. You just listened to what was ever on the radio or what you had in your cassette player. And I am aware, of course, reflecting on this more as an adult, but maybe even then it bothered me, even though, of course, I didn't have the language to describe what was happening. But I am aware now, and I remember being affected by this, but like I said, I didn't know how to get out of it or how to describe it more accurately. But, you know, back then when we couldn't select our music and we just listened to what was ever on the radio, some of that music I think had a negative influence on many of us and probably still does. I mean, a lot of music these days is just junk, but people have, for better or for worse, they have more control over what they listen to. So in my case, if I'm listening to a song and I have some control over it, I can choose to skip it or delete it to not listen to it again. But, you know, back in the day when we didn't have so much control, we were forced to listen to the completion of the song and hope that the next one was better. But what I'm getting around to saying is a lot of those songs had, I think, a negative influence, potentially on me, but certainly on the culture as a whole, because a lot of those songs are just stupid, you know? So, you know, musicians and singers get an audience based on the popularity, or maybe the music is good and the lyrics are junk, and so they sell, 8 million copies. But let's assume for a moment that the music is good and the lyrics are junk, because usually the lyrics are junk. they're not going to convey anything of meaning or complexity. They're just going to convey whatever the singer or the songwriter is thinking of at the moment. It could be a drunk night doing stupid stuff. And then that becomes a song and it sells millions of copies. And then you've got literally tens of millions of people being influenced by those ideas, even though the ideas themselves maybe have no value or they have a negative value. And I know that, a lot of the music in the 70s and 80s was really codependent. And it was all about, devotion and love and just flat out codependence. But a lot of us were exposed to that type of music when we were at such a young age. We didn't even know what love was or what love should be or what love really is. So, a lot of us were raised on these fantasy and really stupid and kind of deformed and codependent versions of so-called love that we learned from, popular culture, whether it's movies or television shows, but especially music, because music is very repetitive. So let's say that some producers, make a stupid movie about being emotionally codependent. I mean, there's plenty of movies like that and television shows too. But one of the two distinctions there are, even if you were to watch that particular movie 2 or 3 times, it's only 2 or 3 times. And usually, especially back then, we didn't have the power to even, rewind a television show, let alone watch it whenever we wanted. But with music, we can be exposed to a given song hundreds of times. And if it has, socially dysfunctional lyrics, let's say, or codependent lyrics, then we're going to be exposed to it and exposed to it and exposed to it. And it can influence the way that we think about things, just in terms of volume of repetition, but also the fact that it has music, obviously in the background. So you've got these codependent or dysfunctional lyrics on repeat, accompanied by music, and I think that kind of helps it kind of sink into the brain at a deeper level. Anyway, that's just an idea. So anyway, back to this article, which is the focus of today. It's kind of the conversation piece of the day. So again, I'll introduce this, we'll look at the article, and then I'm going to tell you what I think are the big take-home messages from this article. So that was my scoping and personal introduction to this article. Let's look at this article now. Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, 2001. I used to be a member of the Royal Society of Medicine when we lived in Europe, but it's just a social group. I mean, they have a nice venue, because I've stayed in their hotel a few times in London. They've got a really nice client or member hotel that's really nice. And then they have another one that's just like medical barracks, and that one's pretty lame. And they also have like a meeting club and a restaurant, things like that. So it's an actual physical location, the Royal Society of Medicine. But anyway, it's basically just kind of a social club. But they do have a journal. Maybe I'll publish something there eventually. So the Mozart Effect, Royal Society of Medicine, 2001. In 1993, these researchers made the surprising claim that, I'm going to talk about this song in just a minute. I'll give you a sample of this song because I don't like it. But it is considered an exemplary piece of very structured and very sophisticated music. And you'll see that's kind of a recurrent theme when we talk about the Mozart Effect. So in 1993, these people made the surprising claim that after listening to Mozart's sonata for 2 pianos, K448, for 10 minutes, normal subjects showed significantly better spatial reasoning skills compared to a control group that just listened to whatever. Mean spatial IQ scores were 8 and 9 points higher after listening to the music than in the other 2 control conditions, and the enhancing effect only lasted for 10 minutes. Well, if they only listened to the music for about 10 minutes, then you would expect a short-term effect. You wouldn't expect that someone's going to listen to one song for 10 minutes and then have an effect forever. So it was a short-term exposure followed by a short-term modification in brain function. And so again, the way that I'm going to structure this after my, kind of personal intro and segue is introduce this article, go through the article, and then I'm going to tell you what I think this article conveys in terms of importance. So let's take a look at the article again. I'll start obviously with the first paragraph. So after listening to Mozart's sonata for 2 pianos, again, it's K448. I'll give you some samples of that right now so that you can at least know what they're talking about. that particular piece of piano music, again, obviously from Mozart, is the one that's most commonly been used to demonstrate this Mozart effect, which is a objectively measurable increase in intelligence, especially for spatial temporal reasoning, like building things or manipulating things in physical space is basically what that comes down to. It doesn't, according to the strict view of the Mozart effect, the intelligence enhancing effect of music only applies to spatial temporal reasoning. However, I think that's a mistake. I think that's a mistaken interpretation. Even though it's a strict interpretation, I think ultimately it's mistaken. And I'll try to discuss that after we look at the article. Anyway, let's look at the article, and then by now in the video, which of course I'm going to have to edit and shuffle the pieces around, by now in the video I will have let you listen to 2 different samples of that K448 piece from Mozart, which is again, it's kind of the exemplar. But I personally think they should have used different music. And so hopefully I'll remember to talk about that toward the end of the video. So, okay, so personal introduction to this article. We'll go through the article after I've given you the 2 samples of that music. And then I'm going to talk about my interpretation of this article, which means I'll have to pull up my copy of the article right now. And I'll just go through my notes. So let's look at my notes on this article right now. And let's see how I want to do this. If I want to record the screen so I can. So give me just a second to record the screen so that you can see what I'm seeing, which is just it's the PDF article that I'll provide. Hopefully we are recording, or at least getting close to recording. We're not recording. Now we are. Hold on, I have to change this. We're getting pretty close to recording. Yeah. Well, let's see. That's not exactly what I wanted either. I have to change that. There we go. Okay. Well, hold on. We're not quite there, but we're getting really close. Okay. In 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. Now we are recording my review of this article. So let's look at this article now. So again, the classic Mozart effect is listening to Mozart Sonata for 2 pianos, K448, and then having an objective, measurable effect on spatial temporal reasoning that lasts for about 10 minutes. Well, so how could we make that better? Well, number one, we could choose a different song. So they've only chosen that song, but it's not like we could certainly find other music that may be better. And they've said that as well. What has worked for me through sheer luck, but also through what I perceive as my experience, is the music of Strunz and Farrar. So I would take the music of Strunz and Farrar any day over Mozart. I can barely listen to Mozart. I've tried to listen to him. I know he's a musical genius. I know he's one of the musical prodigies of humanity throughout history. I know all that, but that doesn't mean I have to like his music. And I've got a few CDs or downloads or whatever of Mozart, and I have to basically force myself to listen to it. So I think either, generally speaking, different music could have been chosen, or for me, different music has to be chosen, because I've got nothing for Mozart. But anyway, that's the definition of the classic Mozart effect. 10 minutes of listening to this particular song, and then a short-term increase in intelligence, especially in the domain of spatial temporal reasoning. Well, could they have done better with different music? Yeah. So we could change the music. I'm just going to make a few notes, and then I'll type these out. So we could change the music. Sorry about that rattling sound behind me. I'll have to write in my own hand here. They could have changed the music, but they certainly should change the duration. 10 minutes is barely enough. So if they want a long-term benefit, then they need to provide a treatment of extended duration, not just 10 minutes. That's ridiculous. So we need different music, we need more time, and we need time not simply going from 10 minutes to 30 minutes, but I'm talking about days, weeks, months. And they did that in a different study that I'll show you in the same article. They, instead of letting people passively listen to music, they provided these children with a 6-month music class And they got better results there. And that's exactly what you would expect. Because that's not simply listening to music, but it's actually understanding the music and then being able to express that music by whatever, playing piano or whatever they did. So that's another very important part of the information that was reviewed in this article. But this is where, very quickly, I mean, we're still in the same, we're in the second paragraph here. This is where this particular article, for me, had a higher level of importance. Not simply talking about the Mozart effect, but showing that the effect actually worked in animals. So this is huge. The fact that the Mozart effect works in animals is showing all of us that a person doesn't have to know anything about music. They don't have to appreciate it. They don't have to feel stimulated by it or relaxed by it. They just have to let the music tones kind of flow over their brain, and the music tonality and the structure of the music itself seems to change brain function. For me, that was awesome. I enjoyed reading that. So let me just look at that. We'll look at exactly what they said here. Animal experiments in which separate groups of rats were exposed in utero, followed by a postpartum period of 60 days, to Mozart's Piano Sonata K448, same one that we've already talked about, in contrast to a control group that got other music. The Mozart group completed the maze test significantly more quickly and with fewer errors than the other three groups. Thus, and this is what I said a minute ago, thus enjoyment and musical appreciation is unlikely, he should have said impossible, to have been the basis of this neurocognitive improvement from the music. I think that's amazing. So that was great. And you're going to see that again. So remember, they exposed these animals to Mozart, and the animals became smarter in their ability to manage temporospatial reasoning, in this case, going through a maze. I think that was amazing. So let's look at, so I'm just going to do this in sequence, even though it's not the sequence I would prefer. But this is a good section as well. So you can see here, I annotated this by saying it's the animals, it works in animals. But basically what you get out of this part of the article is that listening to music affects the entire brain. And I would argue, reasonably, that that's where the real benefit of music is. It's not simply in spatial temporal reasoning, as is demonstrated, within 10 minutes, but rather in integrating the entire brain together. I think that's where the payoff is here. I just kind of think that intuitively, but based on my limited personal experience, I think that's where the payoff is. Making the entire brain work better. So through different imaging techniques like functional MRI, for example, they can have people listen to music and see what part of their brain is being activated. Well, it turns out a lot of different parts of the brain are being activated. And you would expect further that those parts of the brain that are activated would be more intense and also different in people who actually play music, not simply listen to it, or people who listen to it at kind of a low level of appreciation versus people, for example, who have perfect pitch, whether they play music or not, and this includes me, who have a much more intense relationship with music just based on the way their brain is already wired. So, we could say we have basic listening, then we have very kind of hyper attentive. On the other extreme, we have hyper attentive listening, and then we have listening at the level of people who actually understand the structure and can play it. So you would expect reasonably that would impact quantitatively and qualitatively different areas of the brain in different ways, depending on how people are listening to the music. So it's not just it is, but beyond the fact that it is, beyond simply listening to the music is also some level of cognitive interaction with the music. Anyway, I thought that was pretty amazing. So basically listening to music is a whole brain event. So here he talks about some long-term effects of music on the brain. Again, most of the studies were short duration. I just think it's pathetic. Here, these kids got keyboard music lessons for 6 months, Beethoven and Mozart, spatial temporal reasoning tests calibrated for age, showed that their performance was more than 30% better than the control group. Again, the improvement was limited to spatial temporal reasoning. So what? So maybe keyboard, which is obviously physical. I guess all music is somewhat physical, but maybe they could look at using other types of music to impact other regions of the brain. I mean, here I don't know why, but they have consistently focused almost exclusively on Mozart here with a little bit of Beethoven, but maybe other music would impact other parts of the brain. So here, they actually did show some extension, as I was mentioning before. If music affects the entire brain, as was demonstrated and reviewed here, then you would expect that eventually it would spill over to other parts of the brain, and that's what they documented here. Enhancement of spatial temporal reasoning in children after piano training has resulted in significantly greater scores in higher mathematics. And again, it's stimulating the brain, but also synchronizing, as you would expect, different regions of the brain. This part was also awesome, which is why I highlighted it and starred it, as you can see here. So here they're showing that listening to music actually affects measurable brain function in people who have epilepsy, showing a reduction in their kind of erratic or spontaneous eleptogenic brain activity. So this was awesome. This was a great section of the article. And what else did I want to say about this? Oh, yeah, they showed one particular patient. Oh yeah, this section right here. So I'll just read these two sentences. Watch what happens with these two sentences. In two other patients with status epilepticus, which means a constant seizure activity, continuous bilateral spike and wave complexes were recorded 90 to 100% of the time before the music and suddenly began falling to 50%. So that's a 50% reduction in abnormal brain activity within 5 minutes. I just think that's amazing. But look at this next sentence. The fact that improvement took place even in a comatose patient demonstrates again that the appreciation of the music is not a necessary feature of the Mozart effect. I thought that was amazing. So that's why I chose this particular article, because this article is awesome. Again, Mozart's Double Piano Sonata K448. I don't like it at all. So here they talk about some of the structure of the music that may, as they say here, resonate with the brain. That's a good way to say it. Let's see, that might be the end of it. So, like I've already said, and I think anybody could think this intuitively, using longer term exposure to Mozart and a wide selection of other composers, yeah, that would be pretty damn reasonable. So when I listen to that particular piece from Mozart, I'm totally nonplussed and unimpressed, and I don't like it. I mean, I literally would have to force myself to listen to it. But on the other hand, as I have already mentioned, I've had 30 years of experience, personal experience, listening to Strunz and Farah, and I can basically listen to them all day. In fact, whether you can hear it or not, I've got them playing in the background. So I think for today, since I'm already a little bit more than 35 minutes into this, I'll let this be sufficient for today, and then I'll take the conversation to some other levels later. But again, I was actually, speaking of Strunz and Farah, I was actually talking with Jorge Strunz the other day on email, and that's how I got interested in this topic again, because I was trying to convey to him my personal experience with music, a little bit of it, obviously much shorter than this 35-minute video. And in the process of talking about the Mozart effect, I looked at the research that I either had never looked at or hadn't looked at recently, and I was obviously struck by this particular article that shows, let's just go through the highlights here. The effect works, it's reproducible, it's consistent, it works in animals. Listening to music affects many different portions of the brain. Mostly limited, in short-term studies anyway, mostly limited to spatial temporal reasoning, but it can spill over into other areas. I would say language and mathematics would be the most obvious. And if you look at the diagram that I've put together over the last couple of years, the four main quadrants of that are, let me just think about it for a minute. I think it's music, mathematics, language, and science as kind of the four pillars, so to speak, of how human consciousness kind of relates to reality, based on certain structures that exist in nature beyond simple patterns. I mean, if you look at the entirety of mathematics, which I have only barely started to study mathematics. I just bought two textbooks on mathematics just this year. So in 2026, like I said recently, in 2026, I'm going to call myself a mathematician, because now I'm actually reading books on mathematics. But if you look at mathematics, music, language, and our appreciation of the natural sciences, all of those are patterns that humans can recognize. But they don't simply exist as patterns because we recognize them. They exist as patterns in nature, you know? So one of the things that I saw a couple of years ago, I think the author's name was Penrose, and the conversation that he was leading, it was an interview or a two-person conversation. But he asked a very interesting, or he addressed a very interesting question in that interview or that conversation. And I think what he says about mathematics could also apply to language, natural sciences, and music, if I didn't already say that. So again, the four main cornerstones are music, mathematics, language, and natural sciences. But in that particular conversation, Dr. Penrose, I presume, addresses the question, is mathematics discovered or invented?
In a sense, that had to be so, because if the physical world depended so precisely on these mathematical laws, I couldn't have known what to do in a certain sense if the mathematics hadn't already been there. I mean, it's not us that imposes this on the world. It's out there. Sometimes people think that, you know, maybe the reason we have good mathematical laws of physics is that's the best way we can come to understand the world. But it's something more than that. It really is out there in the world.
Well, that's the argument. Whether mathematics is invented by us, by human beings trying to impose our way of thinking on the physical world, or whether it is discovered because it's already out there and we're finding it because it's already there. Those are the two polar views.
Sometimes people do argue. They say, well, you know, it's just our way of organizing the what we see about us. But I really don't think that's good enough. But
if mathematics, like music, like language, like natural science, is purely an external phenomenon, obviously that's the question that he's addressing. Is it something that exists independently of human logic, or is it something that humans construct and then kind of impose on the universe? You know, so I guess one of the ways of looking at that might be the directionality of that relationship. So you've got humans here. Let me think of how this works. The way that I want to think about it, or the way that I'm kind of imagining it right now, is the word that I just used a moment ago was directionality. But what would be that directionality? The directionality itself would be our perception of logic, I think. But the way that he posed the question then is, so if you've got humans here and you've got logic, which is kind of our interpretation of the world, I think a way of phrasing his question is logic something that we impose on the world, or is logic something that the world imposes on us? So I never thought of that before, so I don't even know if I have an answer to the question that I'm only barely grasping. But I think I'll leave today's conversation at that and then try to address that in an upcoming video. Hope you're all doing well. Take care and Happy New Year. Bye-bye.
Music matters for the mind in two important ways. First, quantitatively, because we generally spend hours and ultimately years listening to music, either directly, attentively, or passively, whether we choose it, or if it is in the background and ambience of other settings, such as while working, shopping, eating, and exercising. As such, musical patterns, and especially any accompanying lyrics, eventually become hardwired into our neural brain circuitry and thereby influence our perspectives, mood, and abilities as an extension of the Mozart effect. Second, qualitatively, because of the aforementioned rewiring of the brain depending on the quality, complexity, and cleanliness, when instrumental or contamination, with lyrics of the music. Occasionally, we are seduced by tonality that carries new ideas in the accompanying lyrics, and this eventually forces us to change our perspectives and thereby change our lives. Dr. Alex Vasquez, January 2026.
Mas quem nada sai da minha frente que eu quero passar, pois seu samba está animado. O que eu quero é samba, este samba que é misto de maracatu. É samba de preto veio, samba de preto. Mas quem nada, samba como este tão legal, você não vai querer que eu chegue no final.
Music matters for the mind in two important ways. First, quantitatively, because we generally spend hours and ultimately years listening to music, either directly, attentively, or passively, whether we choose it, or if it is in the background and ambience of other settings, such as while working, shopping, eating, and exercising. As such, musical patterns, and especially any accompanying lyrics, eventually become hardwired into our neural brain circuitry and thereby influence our perspectives, mood, and abilities as an extension of the Mozart effect. Second, qualitatively because of the aforementioned rewiring of the brain depending on the quality, complexity, and cleanliness, when instrumental or contamination, with lyrics of the music. Occasionally, we are seduced by tonality that carries new ideas in the accompanying lyrics, and this eventually forces us to change our perspectives and thereby change our lives. Dr. Alex Vasquez, January 2026.
Mas quem nada sai da minha frente que eu quero passar, pois seu samba já me mago. O que eu quero é samba. Este samba que é misto de maracatu. É samba de preto veio, samba de preto. Mas quem nada, samba como este tão legal, você não vai querer que eu chegue no final.